And so through this training, I've learned a lot about what it means to work for peace and to live in accordance with nonviolence. And I just want to share a few teachings that I've learned from that. In the trainings, we oftentimes talk about the difference between nonviolence spelt with a hyphen and nonviolence spelled without a hyphen. Non-hyphen violence and nonviolence without the hyphen. And we oftentimes say that when you hyphenate the word, nonviolence, it separates the word and actually turns the word into an adjective. All that says is something is not violent. Something is the absence of violence. And I say that that is the biggest misconception that exists of the idea of nonviolence. As long as I'm not being violent, then I'm practicing nonviolence. And that couldn't be further from the truth. I live in a neighborhood in Oakland called Funktown, which is actually known as one of the most diverse neighborhoods in the entire country. And it's a beautiful neighborhood, and it's also a neighborhood that has its fair share of challenges, and people fighting and yelling and arguing is a pretty common occurrence. About 2 years ago now, I was taking a nap. It was about 10 o'clock in the morning, and I'd gone back to sleep, and I was woken up by some commotion outside, and this couple were arguing. And I was just trying to go back to sleep, but this argument kept getting louder and kept getting louder and kept getting louder, and I finally decided to get up out of my bed and see what was going on downstairs on the second floor, and there was a woman on the ground who was getting beat. And she was screaming and she was crying for help. And so I jumped up out of my bed, put on my clothes, I put on my shoes, I ran downstairs, I opened up the gate, and by this point they were across the street, still going on. So I ran across the street and broke up this fight. And meanwhile, about 15 of my neighbors had gathered, and they were just watching this woman get beat as if it was entertainment for them. And I say that all of my neighbors who were just there as bystanders, just watching the violence, were being non-hyphen violent, in the sense that they weren't the ones throwing the punches and throwing the kicks. They were just being bystanders. And so you see the big difference that it makes when we think of nonviolence as just not being violent. You can easily pass that off as being a bystander to violence. Nonviolence isn't about what you don't do, but it's about what you're going to do in the face of violence. When you see violence and injustice in your community, what are you going to do about it? And that completely changed my perspective of nonviolence as oftentimes a weak and passive force. And this understanding of nonviolence also leads to a very dangerous and harmful misinterpretation of the concept of peace. In the early 1950s, there was a woman named Authren Lucy who became the first black student enrolled in the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. And the first day that she was on campus, there were riots. People burnt crosses and broke windows and threw stones at her. And a mob surrounded the car that she was traveling in and climbed up on top of the car and started jumping up and down. And so in response to that, the school expelled her, saying she was causing all of this violence. She was inciting all of this violence. And so they threw her out. The next day, she wasn't on campus anymore, so the riots had stopped. The local newspaper ran a headline that said, "Authren Lucy expelled. There is now peace on the campus of Tuscaloosa." Because it was quiet, because it was calm, because you couldn't see the tension. And that's so often how our society understands peace, as something that's calm and quiet and peaceful. Dr. King called this peace a negative peace. And he responded to that incident in a sermon called "When Peace Becomes Obnoxious." And he said that that wasn't a real peace, that it was a negative peace. It was the absence of tension that came at the expense of justice. And oftentimes when we think of peace as just the absence of violence, in our minds we can begin to justify going to war to create peace. Because we can just kill all the bad people, then we'll have peace over here. Same thing with mass incarceration. If we just lock up all the bad people, then we'll have peace in our communities. I always say, living in a place like Oakland, that if all we want is less violence in our community, let's just lock up every single young person, and we would have less violence in our communities. But that's an entirely different thing than creating peace. We have to remember that peace in a world where violence is the norm is not a calm and quiet process, that peace is messy and it is loud and it is noisy. We have to remember that of all the times that Dr. King was arrested, many of the charges that he faced was disturbing the peace, right? Because he was disturbing the complacency that so oftentimes is misunderstood as peace. In order to create positive peace, we need to disturb the negative peace. So when people say to Black Lives Matter protesters, just be peaceful, it's the most ironic thing because that's what they're trying to do, is to create peace. And oftentimes when we're on the pilgrimages with the monks and nuns of Nipponzan, drumming and chanting, people will come out and say, hey, can you be quiet? And we have to remember that the noise that we make, whether it's with our drums or the chants in a demonstration, is an attempt to create peace. That getting to a place of peace is a messy and loud process, and we need to be okay with that. So I'm really grateful, because if it weren't for Nipponzan, I wouldn't have learned all of these lessons that I've come to understand, if it weren't for the investments that they made in me when I was just 17 years old. So I want to share a couple of stories about my work with some young people and the importance of investing in the coming generations. Most of my work that I do now is in the prison system and the county jails in California, where we are working to build an army of peace warriors from within the prison system. And about a year ago, I was in Soledad State Prison, and I was doing a lecture with about 250 men. And after after I spoke, we opened up the mic to hear from some of the men, some of their reflections. And a young man named Royale, 22 years old, came up and spoke on the mic, and he said, you know, I'm 22 years old, I've been locked up since I was 18, and I came to this lecture because I was bored and I just wanted to get out of my cell. And I didn't think I would get anything out of it. But for the first time in my life, I heard you say that I could be something more than a criminal and a thug, that I had a second chance. And now that I've heard that, I want to start making changes in my life. And this young man has since come home, and he's in a transitional home near Oakland where I live. So I've been spending time with him, and it's been amazing to see this transformation of him reconnecting with his son and talking about wanting to mentor more young people. And it amazes me that that's all it took, was for one person to say that he could be something more than a criminal. And in 22 years of his life, society had failed him in that. That simple act of one person investing in him and believing in him, 22 years that hadn't happened. I was in a training last week, or 2 weeks ago, with Lucas. We were working in San Quentin State Prison and some other folks on the outside, and there was a story an older man told about when he was in school, and his high school guidance counselor told him, you know, I don't really care if you learn anything in this school or not. And so he dropped out. And one of the facilitators asked, well, what would you have liked to hear from your counselor at that moment? He sat there, he thought about it for a moment, he said, how are you? How's things at school? How's things with your family? And I was struck at the simplicity of it. As complex as all of these issues are, and as complicated as social change work can be, on the flip side, it's so simple. It's about asking people how they're doing and believing in them and reaching out a helping hand. In 2009, there were more people murdered in the streets of Chicago than there were soldiers killed in Iraq or Afghanistan. And in the midst of that violence in the world, in Chicago, I was at a high school called North Lawndale College Prep. And this is a school that decided to invest completely in peace and nonviolence. We trained the entire faculty, trained the entire student body, and it started with a week-long training for the student leadership. It was a group of about 25 students. And in the middle of the training, a young girl received a text message that says her best friend was just shot. And she was in critical condition at the hospital. So we stopped the training, and we circled up, and we sang songs, and we were talking about the violence that these young people live with every single day. And one of the teachers said, you know, even in the city of Chicago, there are neighborhoods where young people getting shot is not part of the daily reality, that this level of violence is not normal. And another young girl who was a sophomore at the time stood up And she said, what? And she started getting aggressive, and she started becoming confrontational and arguing with us. She says, that's not true. This is how it is everywhere. And this is how it's always been. And it struck me in that moment that for this young girl, that heightened level of violence was all she's ever known, that she couldn't even conceptualize the fact that there were neighborhoods even today where that wasn't the daily reality. This young girl went on to become one of the student peace warriors of that school, and that school saw a 70% reduction in violence in the first year of that program, and they followed that up by a 90% reduction over 4 years, because we invested in the young people and we gave them leadership, we gave them control over the culture of their own community. And it's amazing how sometimes we so underestimate the power of young people. There's another story of 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama, when a lot of the adults who were part of the movement were too scared to march anymore and couldn't find the courage to go to jail and to get arrested. And I'm sure many of you have seen images of the civil rights movement of the fire hoses and the police dogs, and that was all in Birmingham. And what a lot of people don't know about those images is all of those people who were being hosed down, they were high school and middle school students. During the summer of 1963, about 4,000 young people went to jail and got arrested. And one of the adults that joined them in solidarity was comedian Dick Gregory. And he tells a story of when he was in the jail, and he saw a 4-year-old boy who was locked up. And he asked this 4-year-old boy, he's like, what are you doing here? You're 4 years old, what are you doing in jail? And he said, Teedum. That he was too young, that he couldn't even say freedom properly. So he said Teedum. That a 4-year-old child had the clarity of mind to know that he was in jail for Teedum is evidence to me that young people, we always look at young people as the leaders of tomorrow, when every movement shows that young people have always been the leaders of today. And it's when adults take a step back and give them that space that they can really step into their role, and we need that. And I want to end with one story that I heard about a place in India, in northeast India, called Meghalaya. And Meghalaya is a rainforest in the northeastern part of India, and it's apparently one of the rainiest places on earth. And during the monsoon, the rivers flood. And so hundreds of years ago, the people that live in the forest had to figure out a way to get to the other side of the river during the monsoon. And they created this ingenious solution where they take the root systems of young rubber trees, and they start weaving them into bridges while they're still young, so that they're malleable and you can weave them together. And eventually these things grow into living bridges that spans from one side of the bank to the other. And there's some bridges that are double-decker bridges, and they're majestic, and they're still alive, these bridges, still growing. And the challenge with these bridges is that it takes generations to build, because you have to wait until the root systems get to the other side of the bank and grow big enough and strong enough to carry the weight of people. And there's a scene in a documentary film that I saw of an old man who's teaching this young girl, his niece, baby niece, how to tend to these bridges. And he's explaining to her, I'm never going to walk on this bridge. You might never walk on this bridge. But if we continue to tend to it, your children and your children's children will be able to walk on this bridge, just like the bridges that we walk on today were built by our ancestors. And I find that to be such a powerful parallel for the work of nonviolence and the work of social change. Because sometimes it's daunting, this work. Like, we talk about peace, and yet we see so much violence in the world, and every time a new war starts, every time a young person gets shot, it's depressing. But we have to keep in mind that it's not even about us. It's about what we can accomplish with the help of many, many future generations. The bridges that we're walking on now, that we're using now, were built by our ancestors. Whether it's Fujii Guruji, or Nichiren Daishonin before him, and the Buddha before him, or Martin Luther King, and Gandhi before him, and Tolstoy before him, and Jesus before him. We're walking on the bridges that they laid out. And our role isn't necessarily to reach the other side of the river. Right? Our role is to just tend to our portion of the bridge. And when I think of it that way, it's just like a weight off of my shoulder, because all I need to do is play my role. All I need to do is tend to my portion of the bridge and make sure that the generation that's coming after me, that we're passing on those lessons and having faith that if we continue to do our portion, tend to our portion of the bridge and invest in the next generation, then maybe future generations will be able to reach that other side of the bridge and will be able to reach beloved community. And so I'm so grateful to the monks and nuns of Nippon Zanmyo Hoji for having invested in me when I was young, and for teaching me these lessons and for helping me understand what my portion of the bridge is. And I'm so grateful to all of you for showing up and for investing in this community and for investing in beloved communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you.